Comrades, welcome in, everyone. This is the Dan Simpson Show with Dan Simpson, and today we'll be learning with Larry, aka Leaping Larry, and we'll be learning about Landback. And today is February 29th, so this is Leap Day with Leaping Larry. You like that?
Oh,
yeah.
shit.
And we'll be defining our understanding of the Landback movement and its relationship to Marxist theory. This is what we're considering a Landback for Marxists 101, an introduction, and we'll be using Chapter 6 of Stalin's The Foundations of Leninism on the national question as a starting point for our discussion. Replay viewers and listeners are encouraged to pause here and study that short text, and a link to which can be found in the show notes here. Live viewers, please put your name on your homework and pass it to the front. All right.
No cheating.
No cheating. Larry, welcome in today. How are you doing? What's up?
I'm doing all right. Just you know, chilling. I was doing some streaming and then raided you, so here I am to talk.
Well, thank you for the raid. For folks who don't know who Larry is a communist and a variety streamer. Twitch.tv/leaping_Larry. You can find Larry on Twitter, twitter.com/Juche_gang, as well on YouTube. And if you search Juche Gang on YouTube, it'll come right up. Perfect.
I'm not the Juche Gang co-op. I'm Juche Gang.
Very good. There are different people.
There's two, yeah.
So let's, Larry, before we dig in, give a little bit of context here. Let's set the stage for the chat a little bit and talk what Landback is. Landback is, stop me if I'm wrong, a growing movement. It's been sparking a lot of discourse online and in real life. Generating new decolonial theory, which we're very excited to see and read, and also generating veritable chauvinistic white supremacist strawman arguments alike. So some good and some bad. This is, I think, an especially important conversation for Western, especially white Marxists to have right now, as we engage in theoretical struggle against the Westoid Patsock tendency, the anti-Landback national chauvinists with Marxist characteristics, exemplified by the likes of Jackson Hinkle, the Midwestern Marxists, Adam Tahir, aka Haz al-Din, and others. Well, let's talk Landback, Larry.
Well, glad to.
Let's start with what it isn't, because there are a lot of common misconceptions about Landback, and some of those strawman arguments used against Landback. I'd like to talk about what Landback isn't. You want to start there?
Sure. I mean, I alluded to something earlier, and I just want to, while I'm saying this, I want you to keep in mind that Landback really means liberation.
Okay.
And before what the reactionaries try and refer to as being Landback as this very specific thing, which is how they try and portray it as a bourgeois started thing, right? Like with any movement, whether it's feminism or whatever it is, bourgeois elements and white elements always seek to co-opt it. Like that is how it works with communism in general, with socialism as well. You know, contrary and counter-revolutionary elements always want to co-opt that. And so basically what a lot of these reactionaries do is accept that and as representative of the movement itself. It's like looking at Midwestern Marx or Hinkle and thinking they're representative of communists.
Oh, God. Please don't.
So you see the problem there. Landback also isn't balkanization, which is like the other thing we constantly hear. It's not the idea that all of these nations will be separate little nations all with their square borders, because I mean, this is a white colonial invention, right? Like the idea of these ethno-states, a state for this ethnic group, a state for that ethnic group, that is a white European invention. That has never been a thing that has guided nationhood regarding First Nations. You know, like blood quantum is something forced on First Nations. So it's not balkanization. It's not the breaking up. And this is kind of another thing that these reactionaries use to try and discredit us by saying, instead of wanting a big confederation, instead of wanting a big unity, a big country of unified nations, what they really want is balkanization, ethno-states. But that couldn't be further from the truth. What we want is the dismantling of the colonial entities called the US, Canada, so forth. And we want a new union of the actual nations of this land. And white people from all different areas of the world don't constitute a legitimate nation on this land. And the fact of the matter is, if they want to continue to live here, they will have to come to learn to live under the leadership of the indigenous people that live here. Just as if you were to go to China or Vietnam, you would live under the rules and the leadership of the Vietnam government, you know?
All right, so if we hit the Landback button now, that would mean that we could only vote for indigenous people for president. Is that what we're getting at?
Essentially. I mean, I'm not going to put it as rigid as that, because at the end of the day, it's up to wherever we're talking about, whichever nation it concerns, to decide how best to do this, right? It's just like we can know a certain amount about revolution, but we can't really know a whole lot about socialist society or communist society. We can make certain overarching predictions, but until we're actually experiencing that, because you see, the opposition is sort of what informs what you have to do in order to defend and consolidate the gains of revolution, right? A lot of what determines that is what we have to fight against, if that makes sense.
I think I'm picking up a lot of what you're putting down. Would it just be like us having the same systems, but it would just be, instead of a white guy, it would be an indigenous guy?
No. It would be the indigenous governments. And I mean, a problem with like white people and settlers is a lot of them are infected with individualism, and it permeates their everyday lives, like to the point, like we were watching actually a thing about gamers and how it was explaining how like white people, you know, and in esports, they like almost are uncomfortable being near each other because they're used to just their friends are online, and they're very isolated and individualized, whereas colonized people like, or like even going to see your relatives is like it's a big event, you know? Oh, we're going to see our relatives, which is how like Home Alone portrays it and stuff like this. A lot of colonized people, you know, we live with our extended families. We take care of our older generations and things like this, you know? Like it's very much more communal living in that sense. So I think there's like there's a whole different government that exists now. It's just that we're not allowed our sovereignty. We're not allowed a right to self-determination without interruption from colonial entities and colonial governments. So most people don't even understand that, right? Like indigenous nations today have their own government systems. They have their own legal systems, right? And they fight to have these actually recognized. And supposedly by treaties that, you know, we have gone through for hundreds of years, supposedly these things are recognized, but functionally we know that they're not, because there's a guardian and a ward relationship, right? Like if you want to talk Marxist terms, we could almost, as we were saying last night on our conversation on subversive history, a class like Marxist terms, like we know proletarian and bourgeoisie. And what makes these things two classes and middle, upper, and lower not classes is the fact that classes really exist in juxtaposition from one another. And it's an independent political entity, right? Like that forms a common interest. In the case of the bourgeoisie, though, that's bourgeois interests. In the case of the proletarian is proletariat. Well, you can also think of colonized and colonizer and settlers and indigenous people as also a class. And like I was saying, like, we don't believe in ethno-states. So really what you have is an example of an independent political entity and the white colonial state trying to eliminate that threat of an independent political entity and, you know, emasculate it as much as they can, get rid of its power and make it the ward of the guardians. So like in Marxist terms, you can look at the colonized people and the colonizers as essentially it's a class relationship at the end of the day that we have to consider, in addition to if you're working class and or if you're, you know, because even that's we'll get to that, but that was even a problem in the USSR as well.
While we're here, who is considered to be a colonizer and who is not?
I mean, people who are of European descent who, you know, we know the country is made immigrants, as they say. And there's two types of immigrants, essentially. There's European immigrants who, you know, came here basically voluntarily. Like maybe they were trying to escape religious persecution or something like this at home, but essentially they all came on the basis and the understanding that they were coming here looking for a better life, right? The other type of immigrant you have are black people who were brought here involuntarily, were forced to come here by these other foreigners, you see. And so that's why also black people constitute a colonized people on these lands that also have a right to nationhood here. Whereas the European people do not have that right to nationhood. Not here.
So getting back to our first question, does that mean that if we imagine colonizing and decolonialization, if someone weren't to study anything about it, but they were just were to imagine, oh, well, decolonization has to be the exact opposite of colonization, that means white people get on boats and they go back to Europe?
I mean, I think, again, you know, you can really think of this in terms of like what Lenin said before, you know, where Lenin said that, as we know, part of like when we build a socialist society, let's say, we know we're not putting all the masses in direct hold of like the state organs. Like it's not a direct democracy or whatever. This is what anarchists and stuff want. We understand that a certain amount of educated revolutionaries are necessary to guide it ideologically, right? And that the working people will live and work much better under the leadership of working people than they do under the leadership of the bourgeoisie. Well, again, you can use the same kind of logic and understand that here in the West, where white settler colonial society has been destroying not only our lands, but also your own social relations and your alienation to your work and to each other. It's destroying those things. And settlers would live and work much better under the leadership of formerly colonized governments, under the leadership of liberated First Nations. You know, it's just like, it's that same logic with socialism. And doing that, the process of Landback is the progress towards socialism. Because liberation has to happen before you can even think about building a socialist society here. To think otherwise is like thinking that you can somehow build a socialist society in an exploitative, oppressive relationship. And the thing that socialism requires is unity. And so if you were trying to build socialism on top of this colonial exploitative system, what you will find is you're not going to have unity, and you're going to have huge sections of not just native people, not just black people aligned with them, but also white people who have actual moral indignation to this and want to ally with the correct way, fighting all against this. Which is why I think like even the type of society that Midwestern Marxists and these people are talking about is a pipe dream in their own minds and not actually a possibility at the end of the day. You know, even as much as they want to think it is, it wouldn't even be possible.
Okay, but can we put them on boats?
Well, this is the other thing. It's up to the nations, again, the liberated nations, to decide what they need to do. And I'll be honest with you. Yes, some people probably will have to leave, you know, like they can make their choice. They can leave or they can stay, and the First Nations legal systems can decide what must happen with them from there. You know, like we're not saying everybody has to go, but we're saying, just like with reactionaries in a communist society, you have to make your choice, right? When you're in that situation, it's like either you follow the laws of the state, or you face the consequences of not following the laws of the state. And if that means deportation, have fun in Europe, I guess.
Larry, if you were in charge, would you let me run one of the re-education camps?
I would let you help out.
Fair. Very good. Well, while we're defining terms here, if someone were to look up Landback on Google or whatever, they might find a basic definition such as the Landback movement advocates for a transfer of decision-making power over land to indigenous communities. Or it might say it's the recognition of indigenous jurisdiction, indigenous legal systems, and indigenous rights to self-determination. Using that as a jumping off point, Larry, how would you say those definitions hold up to maybe your own personal definition?
I mean, I would say that, yeah, they are true, like in what they are saying in their like, you know, the Landback movement does advocate for transfer of decision-making power back to the peoples whose land this is, to indigenous people everywhere. Like Koreans should have, you know, anybody who's the subject of colonialism, yeah, they should have the ability to self-determine their own future in their own lands. Absolutely. You know, yes, we do believe that. But I think like almost both of these definitions sort of overcomplicate what it actually is, right? Like I was saying before, at the end of the day, it's decolonization and liberation. Like it's no more complicated than that. That's what it is. It's liberation. And Landback and liberation is fought for all over the world and has been the starting point of every single revolution that has occurred. Is that fight for Landback. You know, like I think some like Western communists get a weird idea in their head where they think like people in USSR or people in these other countries, all of a sudden, a whole bunch of them became socialist and we're like, oh, we got to fight for socialism, right? Like in certain instances, yeah, the Communist Party was doing this, or communists in social democratic parties were doing this. But the majority of the population and a lot of who aligned behind that, it was because of a lot of what their other program was saying, which was about, you know, returning the land, returning the ability, the right to succession to these other nations. That's what really like compelled them. And that's why you have like with the Russian Empire, first you have the fight against imperialism. First you have the fight against Russian Tsarism. And then you have this period where there's like a big struggle over what the interim government is going to be, what's going to come next. And it's through that struggle that they come to know that socialism is necessary.
Larry, are Landback and decolonization, are these interchangeable terms? Are they synonymous? Are they dissimilar in some ways?
No, decolonization, Landback is decolonization.
Yeah, obviously this is especially relevant right now. We've been hearing a lot about Landback, about decolonization. We've seen people and heard of people using the term Landback in reference to the Palestinian struggle, especially as we're seeing the siege on Gaza and the West Bank and the genocide of Palestinians occurring right in front of our eyes. Obviously, this is happening in the wake of Operation Al-Aqsa Flood on October 7th. So I think we've talked about who is considered a colonizer, who's the colonized. We've started defining some of our terms here. Have we talked enough, Larry, about why you consider Landback, why you consider what you mentioned earlier, decolonization and liberation, why you find these to be, and why we should find these to be important and necessary things? You've touched on, I think, a little bit, and we'll probably dig into it more about how we can't have effectively liberation without centering Landback in any form of revolution that may occur. And we'll talk about how that's scientific and all, but anything else why we want what we might say to those who maybe aren't convinced that Landback is important and necessary?
I mean, I would agree, and yeah, Dave Legend, I just want to like point out in regards to your question, like the so-called prior land claim there is not one that is necessarily all that proven. And secondly, it's not the people from the Bible who are reclaiming the land. It's white European colonists who are doing so. You know, people will do things under a signboard of one thing, and when you look at them, you can functionally see what they actually are. So, you know, I don't think that has anything to do with Landback, or, you know, Landback is synonymous with decolonization and liberation. So it's going to another a country, displacing the people, genociding them, that's not liberation, right? So that's your answer there. And again, I just want to reiterate, as far as it being necessary, like I say, it's that whether you want to accept it or not, the ability to have a socialist revolution, if you're a communist, if you're a socialist, and you want to have a successful revolution here, it's absolutely necessary, because again, what we require is unity. And you can say like, oh, well, Native people and Black people are only this percentage of the population, but the thing is, we also have truth on our side, and that draws actual progressives to that cause, people who actually want to develop in a correct direction to that cause as well, right? And even without that participation, I think we would win anyway. But my position is, of course, that like the type of revolution that Midwestern Marx and other people think of isn't even possible. So yeah, decolonization is necessary if you're a communist and you want revolution.
Yeah.
And I will just say too as well, when we look at this other the definition that you gave me, this generalized definition here, it's the recognition of indigenous jurisdiction. I'm just going to go ahead and post this link right here for you in the chat. And this link links you to a map of native lands. And if you go over to North America, Turtle Island, you'll see native jurisdiction is the entire continent. You see.
I see.
And I also want you to take note, because again, as I was stressing about ethnostate, I want you to take note, like if you zoom in, you'll notice how many of these nations are overlapping with each other. Because again, native nations and native peoples didn't create ethnostates, right? This is a European invention. And we lived even before colonization. Like, for example, my nation was a part of the Wabanaki Confederacy. And this meant that we essentially practiced a form of democratic centralism, where everybody if you actually zoom in there, go back to the map there and you zoom in on Mi'kmaq, Eastern Canada, that's where I am. If you zoom into that, you'll see it says Wabanaki Confederacy.
Yeah.
And you can see Wabanaki Dawnland as part of it, and all these other nations all had a say in the lands that overlap, and then they have say over their own lands as well. And the way it would work is the people would meet either somewhere in Mi'kmaq there or wherever, and all of the public could join it. and the leaders would meet together and discuss and open, and people would be able to contribute to the discussion, and then the majority vote would be accepted by all, and they would go back and continue on with this, with what they agreed upon. Because again, like the idea, you can see with that map, the idea of terra nullius, in other words, the land being empty, is absolutely ridiculous on that face value alone. But then I would also add in that Native people didn't just live in harmony with nature. Like, yes, we had more harmonious relationship with nature, but we also tended and caretaked about in the environments as well. And as far as like, if there was a forest where too many of one kind of trees is growing, First Nations would plant a diversity of trees there to help prevent forest fires. Or in many areas, there would be controlled burns to make sure that that old dead brush was gone and that the forest could, again, sustain itself more readily. First Nations people made the environment more sustainable here. So the idea of terra nullius is absolutely ridiculous. We tended and caretaked every inch of this area, right, of this earth.
I think that's a great illustration, Larry. As in if we hit, I hate to bastardize it, I guess, but if we hit that land back button right now, and of course it'll be a process, it'll take time, just like any revolution does. If we hit that button now, it wouldn't be like states in the way that they're drawn out on our map that we currently use, I guess, or we're being made to use in the so-called United States, where every state is just delineated and it's just, you know what it is, whatever. You have overlapping things here, and I think that's a really mind-opening thing. That's how these lands were tended to. It wasn't just one nation tending to the land. It was many, and they would work together, and that's sort of illustrative that so many people can't imagine what that would be like.
Exactly. And that's why when they imagine decolonization, they like somehow imagine all of these separate states or all of these separate nations. And as you can see, like that's not even like feasible in the context of First Nations conception of nation, right? And First Nation or in practice of how we related to each other. That's why I say like revolution here depends on on this coalition united for that cause of decolonization. We don't have to be united and we don't have to be united for the cause of socialism, right? That's what I was saying. Like the process is that land back, decolonization, liberation happens first. And through that struggle, people come to know the need for socialism. So if you're a communist, the correct thing, the correct line for you to take is to support indigenous liberation, whether or not you think it's going to make the society you're imagining as a communist society or a socialist society or not, right? It's just your duty as a communist, if you're a revolutionary, to support that.
Well, let's get into that. If you are a Marxist and you want to learn more about decolonial theory, this is where the conversation can begin. Engels says, no nation can be free if it oppresses other nations. So before we dig in, as you know, in a lot of Marxist theory, as they're talking about, for instance, national liberation, national self-determination, they do seem to go back and forth using terms nation and countries. Do landback Marxists hold the opinion that, for instance, Lenin was referring to indigenous nations?
I mean, whether he was or not is kind of irregardless, but he specifies colonized nations, right? When he's when he specifies whether he's talking about colonized nations or colonizer nations. And he makes that very clear, regardless of whether he's going back and forth between the words nation and country. Now, I do think that we can have a better analysis of nation and country. And I think we can do that by separating the two terms and realize that nation and country should not be synonymous terms. And we can look all around the world and see why this is the case. Like we can look at China and realize China is a nation. It's also a country. And it's also a multinational country with many nations within it, right? You can look at Korea, and here you have an example where there's two countries, but one nation. Two separate countries. You have Republic of Korea and the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, but they're one nation. They're the Korean nation. And it's in the West, what you have is a prison house of nations on top of a colonial entity that has no actual legitimacy to nationhood by any definition that Lenin or Stalin or anybody has given of what a nation constitutes. And so what you have there is a country posing as a nation that is really a prison house for all of the nations within it. And our goal is not to have a socialist USA or a socialist Canada. As you saw from that map, those borders aren't there. There's no border. There's no Canada-US border. So it's something totally different. The country that's here, if we can push that button right now, the country that's here is the whole thing, you know, and whatever we call it is what we call it. Who knows what it would be called? But the fact of the matter is it's those liberated nations working together voluntarily. And actually in the work that I got people to read, you know, Stalin makes a very important point to point out that, like, communism knows that the world economic system that we're fighting for is only possible on mutual confidence and voluntary agreement. And that means that we have to do that right from the beginning. We can't, like, force revolution on other people, export or import revolution, as Kim Il-sung and Mao and other people have pointed out, and then expect us to have a voluntary union that's going forward to communism. You can only do it by trusting the nations to join you in revolution, and hope by being, like, sincere and genuine and actually all for the same thing, which is a better world, then we will come together and work together. And that's why, like, it's important for countries like DPRK, for example, to take that independent stand that they do. You know?
You're already touching on a lot of really important things, and I think your explanation, Larry, is just setting off a lot of light bulbs. I know it's doing good things for me. So obviously the grander context here is that, like I mentioned at the top, we're engaging in ideological struggle with so-called Marxists who do not support Landback. There are discussions online and off as to whether Landback is compatible to Marxism. That's why we had everyone read Chapter 6 of Stalin's The Foundations of Leninism on the national question, as I thought that if you reach what I agreed with you is that the individual indigenous nations are considered nations, and they're colonized nations within the so-called, I love the prison house of nations phrase, then you would realize that if you apply Engels' logic as well, that no nation can be free if it oppresses other nations, then we're at this point, well, we got to free these nations. We have to do that. Otherwise...
Yeah, I like Rick's point here too as well. Like, it doesn't matter whether decolonization is compatible with Marxism. Marxism should be compatible with liberation of oppressed nations, right?
Yes. And
if it isn't, then, I mean, I'm sure many Marxists would say that's phony or that's bogus Marxism, but we know that there's something struck me about the conversation you had with Matthew, was that, you know, and I know he didn't necessarily mean it the way he said it, but he said that PATSOC is an online phenomenon. And the people who proudly declare themselves PATSOCs and things like this, yeah, sure, they're all very, very online people, right? But all you have to do is look at the programs of many of the existing parties here in the West, in Europe or the Americas, and you'll come to see that many of them take positions that functionally make them PATSOCs, okay? To the point where, like, to give you a specific example, the Canadian Communist Party says that what they fight for is a House of Nations, where instead of the House of Senate, there's a House of Nations, and that the First Nations will have equal say to the white Canadian and the white French Canadian state, the nations. And again, this is like this is a way of them trying to hold on to like colonial power. And the reason no like First Nations person is going to actually accept that program. You know, at the end of the day, if it's like a Trotskyist program. And like the USSR was engaged in a decolonial struggle itself, right? Like the Russian Empire had colonized many other nations that were within it. In fact, Lenin referred to Russia as a prison house of nations. That was one of Lenin's terms that I'm borrowing here to use as on Canada, because it's very applicable. But he used that to describe Russia. And that's why they wrote about the national question and the need to fight for the liberation and the right to succession of all of these formerly colonized nations. And I think Trotsky and Khrushchev and a lot of these other people are really a reflection of, much like what we see today, PATSOKs, a sort of a type of PATSOK. They were Western Russians. Trotsky was Ukrainian, and he saw himself as being more civilized than the Eastern colonized Russian people, to the point where I think that's what his major problem with Stalin was that he saw him as this Georgian, formerly colonized. How the fuck can he lead the revolution? You know, he's just this. Ukrainians and Western Russians should be the ones leading the revolution because they're the civilized ones. And that was the attitude they have. And even people like Emma Goldman weaponized that sort of terminology against Lenin and called Lenin a barbaric Asiatic, for example. Okay, like, so that was a very serious thing. And then think about Khrushchev, whether or not Khrushchev was Trotskyist himself, he has that same attitude again towards China and towards Stalin as well, where I think Khrushchev's big problem with Stalin was, again, the same thing. He was a Ukrainian, and while he was working class, that colonial mindset really infected his outlook of revolution. You know, he thought, like, including like some very like funny statements that are somewhat true, but not in the way he thought them, like, your kids will be communists. You know, like, and the Russian Empire, the Russian communists are just going to teach everybody. And that's why, like, Lenin's struggle for the right to succession was never realized. It was never materialized. Lenin fought for that. Stalin fought for that, but it was never actually legally materialized, right? Like, the right to succession was never fully constitutionalized. It was never fully guaranteed. And to frustrate matters further, there was also the Communist International that existed early on in the movement. And that sort of acted like an international center that was supposed to guide the revolution. And under Stalin's leadership, they came to realize that, okay, there's no need for this, because, you know, what Marxism really discovered is that the proletariat and the working masses and the revolution led by the revolutionary sections, they trend towards that anyway, which is how the Paris Commune happened. You know, it's not that they read Marxism and they started doing the Paris Commune. The Paris Commune happened and Marx studied it and went, oh, crap, okay, this is what the workers do, you know? And so we have to realize that there is that inherent movement towards that. But in the USSR, they didn't trust that. You see, they thought that the Communist Party really had to be the ones to lead this. And this is what Trotsky's permanent revolution is. And so after the Comintern was dissolved under Stalin, that's a great thing. But the habit of copying the Russian Communist Party and the habit of the Russian Communist Party expecting that to happen never went away. Like Khrushchev becoming the leader was, like, that's a bad thing or whatever, that the counter-revolutionary, but so many communists act like that was like the turning point, when these mistakes existed in Lenin's and Stalin's time. It's just under Lenin and Stalin's time, the people were closer to before the revolution. They had a more intimate memory of what was Russia before the revolution, and they were very inspired by their leadership they were receiving. And we can't deny the role that Lenin and Stalin both played in that, right? And with de-Stalinization, you have this divorce of the party and the masses, and it allowed the party to become more and more entrenched with bureaucratism, to expect more and more officially that the other republics just follow what Russia is doing, up into the point where it led to the revisionism and overthrow of the USSR as a whole. And so we can say, like, the failure to actually to consolidate the gains of their anti-colonial revolution, the gains of their struggle against oppression of nation by nation, is what allowed the imperialists to then come in and say, you know, we're gonna play on these national liberation movements and use that to help break up the Soviet Union. And we still see that rhetoric today, right? And of course, it's based on Russian hatred and stuff like that, because that was how they broke it up. But at the end of the day, if they had all had their independent development as nations, they never would have done that. They would have already realized they had national liberation, you know?
Larry, I found the quote that I was thinking of, referring back to the Patsocks, who I think you're saying exhibit a thread of chauvinism as represented similarly by Trotsky and by Khrushchev. A certain kind of chauvinism. And I think if we think of, and what do you think of this? I think you hear people sometimes say that, what am I trying to say? Like, colonized indigenous people it's like imperialism turned inward. Have you heard something like that? What is the phrase?
Yeah, I've heard that, or they would become new bourgeois nations. It's sort of that same idea as that.
Oh, okay.
Like,
I think
it would be revenge or something like that.
Okay.
I mean, at the end of the day, that's what they're scared of, is the idea of First Nations liberated, turning around and doing the same thing they've done for years to them.
I think we're actually talking about slightly different things, but that is also a very good point. Yeah, like, would it just turn into capitalism all over again? Like little capitalist indigenous nations? What the question that I was asking is, the colonized First Nations, is that sort of a form of imperialism turned inward on its on the land of its own country? Or is that a reach? What am I trying to say here?
I mean, in a lot of ways, like, colonialism is like a proto-imperialism, right? Like,
very fair.
Because if you think about what imperialism is like specific in the Leninist definition, is specific to capitalist society when it reaches monopoly, and it goes forth and basically has to look for neo-colonies and so on and so forth to guarantee the expansion of its markets and super profits so that it can placate the labor aristocracy, so on and so forth, right? But like, the thing that makes capitalism possible, the thing that makes imperialism possible, is that proto-imperialism, which is colonialism. And, you know, part of the limitation of Marxism, and by extension Marxism-Leninism, is that a lot of what it takes its philosophy from, at the end of the day, is, and this is, I'll explain why in a minute, but it has some leftovers of bourgeois philosophy. And Marx himself was growing up in a European society. And so his perspective on colonized places can only be as good as a white guy living in Europe thinking what he thinks in 1800s about colonized people, you know? And so, yeah, of course, if you don't think there's going to be limitations there, you're thinking of Marx as a prophet or a religious leader rather than as a science, rather than Marxism as a science that we need to develop and perfect, right?
Yeah.
And like, part of his limitation, I mean, we know part of his limitation was he thought, because of the inequality of capitalism, that's where revolution would break out first, you know? And another one of his problems was, if you look at the Communist Manifesto, he says about primitive accumulation. Well, what primitive accumulation is really just a way for him to it's him glossing over colonialism. Primitive accumulation was the stealing of lands and the gathering of enough resources and power, labor power, in order to make capitalism a possibility, right? And that's what he's talking about. Primitive accumulation then lays the foundation for capitalism to be possible. And he terms it primitive accumulation, but it's really like hundreds of years of colonialism. So it's sort of like he sort of missed the forest for the trees in some ways, thinking that capitalism is the primary contradiction. Mm-hmm. It's not that settler colonialism here is the primary contradiction. It's that colonialism everywhere is the primary contradiction. And awesome. The other proof of this is the fact that Lenin, of course, in his days, we know monopoly capitalism was sort of new. And imperialist powers, capitalist imperialist powers had just emerged, right? And what happened in Lenin's time was they engaged in open conflict with each other for the redivision of the already colonized world, which was colonized by that primitive accumulation. And so the funny thing is, Lenin says, you know, in his like analysis of the situation, and which was true at the time. I'm not saying Lenin's analysis is wrong. I'm saying it has historical limitations. That in 2024, the world's going to be different than in the 1910s when he gave this analysis. And in Lenin's time, the imperialist powers were engaged in open armed conflict. And Lenin saw this as a way that the proletariat and the colonized people could use because imperialism would be focused here on wars with each other, and then that would leave a spot weak enough for the formerly colonized people to realize liberation in that area. And that's why he said that revolution breaks out where the chain of imperialism is the weakest. But Lenin wasn't the only one, and communists who read Lenin weren't the only one who learned those lessons. You know, it's like the bourgeoisie also isn't static in its position. And the bourgeoisie came to learn the same lessons that Lenin did, that when they engaged in open armed conflict with each other, they made it more safe for revolutions to break out. They made it more likely that revolution would break out, or gave people fighting for revolution that more of a breathing room to realize that. And so that's why the forms of imperialism have really changed, that the imperialists came to realize that what they have to do is focus their attention on preserving that colonial white European-led system at any cost. And that's why today what you see is not imperialists engaging in open conflict with each other, which is the misframing they try to do with Russia and Ukraine. And instead what you see is an imperialist power and friendly to colonialism and interested in preserving colonialism, going wherever there is a threat to colonialism, whether it calls itself communist, whether it's a right-wing, whatever, regardless of whatever the movement is, if it sees that as a threat to the colonial system as a whole, then they will invade it, often as a coalition, right? Or in a peacekeeping act, or whatever the hell they want to call it. But we know, like today, that relationship is what exists. It's no longer imperialists engaged in open conflict. They settle their conflicts in other ways now. And that doesn't discredit what Lenin or Stalin said about imperialism always being about war. It is still about war, but it's about war that prevents the people's war from being realized.
So if we think of imperialism as mature colonialism, if we think of colonialism as proto-imperialism, then we see that these two things are very much interlinked, as in when the so-called end of the frontier was colonized here in Turtle Island, that's when the bourgeoisie of this country naturally, if you will, wanted to begin colonizing overseas. And that's sort of how that historical process occurs. So that's important to keep in mind as we read from Chapter 6 of the Foundations of Leninism on the national question, which reads, "The weight of emphasis in the internationalist education of the workers in the oppressing countries must necessarily consist in their advocating and upholding freedom of secession for oppressed countries. Without this, there can be no internationalism. It is our right and duty to treat every social democrat, as they were called then, of an oppressing nation who fails to conduct such propaganda as an imperialist, and a scoundrel. So, if we can refer back to our polemic, our theoretical struggle with the Patsocks, the national chauvinists, would you say that they fail in this test of Marxism? And in that sense, they are imperialists turned inward. They're scoundrels.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is why I constantly tell people, look, you know, we can just call them what they are. They're fascists at the end of the day. Colonialism is fascism. If you're pro-colonialism, what does that make you? The fact that the fact that they deny the fact that First Nations are nations, but it's right in the name. That's why we call them First Nations, right? If like they deny that by using racist terms like tribe, which is really just a racist way of discrediting what a nation is, right? Like it's a way of saying, well, this is just a tribe and this is just their chief, you know? When really both of these words are just like racist ways of trying to like other First Nations people. And that's why, again, I think part of the definition that Leninism used before for nationalism is somewhat erroneous and Eurocentric, again, because of that's it's unfortunately inheritance in Marxism that I think philosophies from indigenous people and the likes of Juche help to overcome further by further critiquing Marxism, you know, and critiquing the reactionaries and the distorters of Marxism as well. And I think like this is such an important thing here because, like I say, these Patsocks, these whatever you want to call them, these chauvinists, it's not something that simply is online. It's not just it's something that infects the leadership of the communist parties here. It permeates the KKE in Greece, you know, it permeates the Canadian Communist Party. They all have the same line in it that really resembles Trotskyism, and that because Trotskyism, like I say, it's not communism, it's not a brand of communism, it's just white European colonialism made to sound communist with communist sounding language, which is the same thing these Patsocks and stuff try to do. They try to take like Marxist words and stuff like that and somehow justify their erroneous positions with Marxist language. When the way they do this is by overcomplicating the essence of Marxism, right? And this is like the most important thing. Again, if Marxism is a science and not simply a religious dogma, then we have to realize that the essence of Marxism, which was the revolution against oppression of human by human, like that's the core of Marxism. If we understand that, then we realize that anything else that runs up against a historical limitation, we have to reconsider. And we have to reconsider it in the goal of being able to realize that liberation, that revolution, right? Because that's what Marxism existed to do. And anybody who makes it seem like more complicated than that is trying to obfuscate the very reason why revolution exists, right? And the fact that Marxism again pointed out that revolution in that direction is simply human progress. And another reason why I fight against stagism is because a lot of these communists believe, like, because they have heard the way Marx talks about how he says like feudalism came first and then there was capitalist society and then there will be socialist society. A lot of them then misinterpret that to mean every single individualized, compartmentalized nation will pass through these stages all in the same way, which is a very metaphysical analysis because it ignores the fact that I can look over at this country and I can learn experiences from that country. So capitalism emerging in one place is capitalism emerging in every place, essentially. And that's why the idea that the revolution, quote unquote, in the US was a revolution is wrong. It wasn't a revolution. It was simply a bourgeois contest between who's going to get the gains of settler colonialism, who's going to get the gains of colonialism in this area. And in fact, it was a counter-revolution, because every mass movement at the end of the day is started by the oppressed people and the proletarians and the people who are exploited. And we can imagine the struggle originally was, and it was a struggle against Britain, was to stop slavery and to stop the expansion of Britain more to the west into more and more native land, right? And nobody's saying that Britain is great or anything, which is how the Patsucks try to discredit Horn. But what we're saying is that contest with Britain, the native people had reached a point where they were saying, okay, no more expansion westward. You know, we're going to end the slavery thing, because not because they were so great or generous, but because of the pressure that First Nations and other colonized people were putting on them. And the US, the bourgeoisie in the US went, hold on, we can get that. We can pick that up. And that's when you have counter-revolution that responds to this and comes in, and they have to fight not just the natives, but now they have to fight the British, who were just convinced by the natives to stop doing this thing, right? Mm-hmm. And that's what the American Revolution represents. So really a way to stall a revolutionary change that was starting to emerge.
We were touching on how Landback, how decolonization is scientific. It's Marxist. And we were touching on primary contradictions and just contradictions in general. Look out. And you were touching on how settler colonialism, for instance, on Turtle Island, represents, I think, if I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I think you were saying it's the primary or the principal contradiction. And we as Marxists ought to be able to identify what those are. If you'll allow me to quote from Mao on contradiction, if in any process there are a number of contradictions, one of them must be the principal contradiction, playing the leading and decisive role, while the rest occupy a secondary and subordinate position. Therefore, in studying any complex process in which there are two or more contradictions, such as in any nation, we must devote every effort to finding its principal contradiction. Once this principal contradiction is grasped, all problems can be readily solved. So, Larry, among Marxists, I think there are some disagreements as to what that principal contradiction here is in the so-called United States. And I think, is that where perhaps some of the breakdown is between the national chauvinists and decolonial Marxists?
I mean, yeah, okay. Part of the breakdown, I think, is first of all, I will say, it's not that, again, as I said earlier, it's not that here settler colonialism is the primary contradiction. It's that everywhere in the world, colonialism is the primary contradiction. Okay. And this is why, like, if you want to get like theoretical or like start imagining the future, this is why I think like Europe would be like one of the last places for socialism to be realized. It would end up being a stronghold of white settler colonialism that will need to be isolated. And the super profits that keep them safe from their own citizens exist because of colonialism and imperialism, right? And that the more revolutions, the more liberation movements gain footholds all over the world, the less super profits these imperialists and colonists are going to have. And therefore, the more strict they will have to, and the more inward they will have to turn their anger towards their own population. And so I can imagine a future where liberated nations are going to have to intervene in Europe and in many ways force it to stop, doing a fascist. Who knows what they're going to do, But I can see I can very readily imagine a future where that's a necessity because of the way that it kind of has to play out, because again, colonialism is the primary contradiction. We have to undo that. And if you don't undo that, you're left with capitalism's ability to regenerate itself. And this is why I think every struggle that has ever occurred, whether it's Cuba, whether it's DPRK, whether it's Russia, they all started with what we can call the democratic revolution.
Yeah.
And that's the revolution against colonialism and imperialism. And that lays the foundation for the socialist revolution to then break out. And all you have to do is look at every example of revolution to see this is the way they played out. And even in some cases, like Cuba, for example, they weren't even Marxist Leninists to begin with, right? And today in Korea, for example, if you call them Marxist Leninists, they'll say, no, actually, we're Kim Il-sungism, Kim Jong-ilism. And too many Marxist Leninists will, on the one hand, discredit that because it doesn't call itself Marxism, Leninism, and white fragility and the way that they think mechanically about Marxism and everything else, they then say, okay, well, therefore, it's not worth studying, right?
Yeah.
And on the other side of the coin, they're like, oh, well, they're just saying that to be different. Like it's like they're lying, or like what they're saying is actually unique about their philosophy. Nah, we don't believe that. It's really just saying the same thing that Marxism, Leninism is saying, right? Which is like really fucking insulting. Like, here's a country that has gone through a revolution, has literally gotten rid of its bourgeoisie, has maintained a socialist society and consolidated the gains of socialism over the course of almost 100 years now. And because they're a small country or whatever else, you have chauvinists in the West who will look and say, oh, well, they don't know as much as I do about socialism. And therefore, Juche, that's just Marxism, Leninism rebranded. And here, I think you have the same problem. And Marxist Leninists will refuse to study indigenous revolutionaries because they might identify themselves as anarchist. Or they might identify themselves as Trotskyists, something Walter Rodney, for example, right?
Yeah.
He, by his own recollection, was a Trotskyist. Okay, but when we actually read his work and we actually look at functionally what he's talking about, it's scientific socialism. Again, Lenin didn't create it. Marx didn't invent it. What they did was analyze these things that already existed, right? They analyzed liberation and independent struggles. And that's why I really like Juche's answer to the idea that all of hitherto society is class struggle. Juche comes in and criticizing the European aspects of Marxism, Leninism, says, actually, no, yeah, all hitherto recorded European white history is class struggle. But he says all of history is actually a struggle against independence, a struggle for the masses to materialize their independence, which in the context of Juche means to overcome all of the fetters which get in the way of their independent development. So whether those are natural fetters, like we all know, if you live in an area and it's continuously hit by storms that destroy crops, people improve that area and will do things to make sure that their crops aren't destroyed the next year, right? They will discover means of overcoming this. And the same goes for society as well. If there's social relations that humanity cannot tolerate or that restricts their independence, it is only natural that humanity develops towards trying to realize that independence. And so the masses are the things that develop history, right? And that's why there's the name reactionaries. The reactionaries react to the masses developing history and trying to prevent them from developing history or turn back the gains of their development. And they can only do that by misdirecting the development and the efforts of the masses, right? And that's why bourgeois power still, even though capital is the thing that compels the masses, their power still relies on the backs of the masses, where to the point where if we all stood up, they're thrown off. They'd be thrown off our shoulders and they're down here with the rest of us. And so I think that's not enough communists understand this. And yeah, it's okay to critique anarchism and point out how most anarchism is white chauvinism, etc. But now if you're examining somebody who calls themselves a white anarchist or a white whatever, or a native anarchist or a Landback anarchist, you have to look at those two things differently. And you have to look at what they're actually saying. Just like with Walter Rodney. You don't just say, oh, he's a Trotskyist, so goodbye decolonial Marxism, or goodbye like how Europe, overexploited Africa. Like that doesn't mean anything to me. It's just, that's not how it develops. And we should expect that, like in the future here, it's okay if we don't call our movement Marxist-Leninist. That's okay. It's up to the people, again, of this land, what it's going to be called. And I think that it's like more accurate to understand that you're going to have a new name arise here that pertains to our actual theory that emerges here. Who knows? Like maybe it's Rickism. You know what I mean? Like who knows what it would be called? But and the reason for that is because the first criteria of whether or not we're waging revolution correctly is not what Marx or Lenin or Engels or any of them wrote. It's, first of all, what is our conditions and what is the correct struggle forward? And of course, the benefit of Marx and Lenin and all these things existing is that we can learn something about their experience. But learning something about their experience and using that as your criteria to judge everything is two separate things, right? And this is, and part of where distorters like Pat Socks are able to work is because they can really like take it as a dogma and therefore like say, this is what Marx and Lenin said. And without thinking about it creatively or anything, sometimes like when you take Marxism mechanically or at face value, yeah, some of what they're saying is true, right? But when you think more deeply about it, you realize it's not true, and even more importantly, not possible. Like the idea that they have about how because the working class is mostly white, therefore they have to appeal to purely the white people and make revolution, and then that will allow autonomous regions for First Nations, right? Like that's an erroneous thing based on the idea that they're analyzing things purely from a class-based perspective. They're analyzing the motive force of revolution from a class-based perspective. And I pointed out earlier how we can say like really the relationship between colonized people and colonizer could be thought of as a form of class. But Marx didn't put it that way, right? And that's why I think it's important that in our analysis of what constitutes the motive force of revolution, we don't just simply say class origin is all that matters. What matters is people's ideology. And here in the West, you have, I think, and I mean, prove me wrong, in the West, you have like lumpen proletariat, people who wouldn't necessarily be considered the classic proletariat from Marx's point of view, the leaders of the revolution, in First Nation communities, and in general, regardless of whether they're lumpen proletariat or even many small business owners or peasant or petty bourgeois, are far more revolutionary than your average white working class American. And like, how can you deny that when I just go out and try and teach white working class people about this shit, right? And you'll see what you come up against. You know what I'm saying? Like, yeah. Even when you're talking about revolution, even when you talk about anti-capitalism, like, well, capitalism is just trade and all this other shit, right? Whereas you look at indigenous people, even many who have small businesses because they're forced into that to survive, because they're left out of employment by white bourgeoisie. Like, many of them already get that, you know? And this is where, again, they will use a mechanical analysis and say, oh, because there's indigenous petty bourgeoisie, if they have liberation, they will grow into the new bourgeoisie. Right?
Yeah.
So it's a combination of things, as well as, again, I said that stagism thing where it's like, oh, well, because they were pre-capitalism beforehand, they still got to pass through a stage of feudalism and a stage of capitalism. Like, we don't already know capitalism is bad. Like, we didn't, you know, like, as if First Nations people here without colonization would have just made capitalism, which I think Marx and Engels and that kind of framing is incorrect, right? That there's no proof that First Nations people would have developed a capitalist system without colonialism. Like, the reason that happened in Europe is because individualism took hold and became a powerful force. And that's why the other thing I try to point out to people is we can't deny the role that ideology plays, right? That people's ideology plays in revolution. And ideology, when gripped by huge sections of people, becomes a material force in its own right. And so many Marxists here are stuck on this, and therefore they say things like, well, we already essentially have the economic relations of socialism. We just have to change the relations to production or something like this, right? But no, that still leaves all the reactionaries. What has to happen when you have the reason why you need a socialist society is because that enables you to re-educate huge sections of people into being socialist people, right?
Yeah.
And I mean, that's what USSR, I think, failed to do as well. Is this they sort of had this idea that they would build a socialist society, and as long as they had socialism, people would just, because, you know, human mind is just a reflection of the material economic conditions, therefore they would just become socialist automatically, and sort of therefore they ignored developing new theory in their areas. Whereas here, again, what stalls revolution? That you couldn't think of a more right place, Mark. That's why Marx thought that this is where revolution would break out first. But the ideological campaign and the reactionary ideology of massive sections of the population fight against revolution. You know, the progressive masses have an interest in it. The reactionary people think they have an interest against it and fight against revolution.
So, Larry, let's do a little bit of review before we take some questions from chat and before I get your ideas on how we can learn more. But I jotted down a few things. Let me know what you think. I got here, Landback and decolonization is liberation theory, which is compatible, or a liberation movement, theory and movement, which is compatible with Marxism, which calls for national liberation and self-determination, and tells us that the indigenous liberation struggle and the proletarian revolution go hand in hand.
Yeah, I mean, First Nations, like I say, I think it's really easy to distill it down. Like, Landback is liberation.
Yeah,
it's as simple as that. Landback is national liberation. You know, it's as easy to distill it down as that. And that's, I think, when you distill it down to, like, these concepts don't have to be complex to be true, right? And I think truth often stands like bare naked in its simplicity. And that's one thing I love about Juche and reading Socialism as Science, where Kim Jong-un really, like, lays things out in very plain language and explains things as they are. And, like, I think that, you know, we can do the same thing. And when you put it like that, it's like, how are they going to argue against that? How are these bogus Marxists actually going to argue against that? And that's when they have to get into all of this bullshit and, like, just make this huge thing and try and, like, quote farm from Marx and find all of these things, because they can't actually argue against it.
Okay, great. So, Landback, decolonization is national liberation. Write it down, boys, girls, they, thems. Let's go. All right, so Larry, we're going to take some questions from chat, and I think we already have one. Is that what you suggest, reading, to really drive this home?
I will get to reading recommendations before I go off.
Yeah, that is coming up here. Any reading recommends? For sure, for sure. All right, well, I guess that's what question they have, which is, you know,
Okay.
what next steps could someone who's interested in learning more take? What should they be reading? Who could they engage with? Who can they talk to? What could they do? Larry, take it away.
I think, like, as I was hinting at kind of before, like, let's get rid of our treating Marxism, Leninism, if that's what you call yourself. I personally, for full clarity, I just call myself a communist. I don't actually label myself a Marxist-Leninist. But if you call yourself a Marxist-Leninist, I think you should remove the tendency to treat Marxism-Leninism as an identity, just as you wouldn't treat anarchism like an identity, which is what so many white people do. Like, rather, like with anarchists, like, what they'll do is they come to learn that term anarchism and they'll say, I'm an anarchist, right? And that because I'm an anarchist, I believe this and that and this and that. Whereas I think colonized people sort of come about this in a different way, where we use these labels to try and express where we currently are in our education. And as many as you know, even though many white people might claim this is the case, we can look and functionally see by talking with them that this is not what they're doing, right? That they are hanging on to this thing as a label and saying, well, because I'm an anarchist, I believe you as a scientific socialist will betray me, or whatever the thing is.
Yeah, there
so
is
I think don't make that same mistake as a Marxist-Leninist. Read Fanon. Read people like Kwame Nkrumah. Read Walter Rodney. Read people who don't call themselves necessarily Marxist-Leninists and learn from them. Glenn Sean Coulthard is another great one to read. But I think importantly, where you are as well, it's important to study the history of colonialization and the history of the struggle against colonization that's relative to your area, you know, like, and you can find out what indigenous lands, what First Nations lands you might be living on or is in your area. And you can even find out what indigenous struggles and actions are going on in your area. And even if you're not part of a party, you can call these places up and ask them if there's support they need. Is there things that you can do to aid them? And they will be, and many will be happy. Just make sure you don't just show up. Make sure you don't just like insert yourself into there, and make sure you do what they say, right? That you don't go in places that they tell you not to go into, that if they tell you to stay out of a conversation, that you stay out of that conversation. But many First Nations will be glad if you call and you say, is there material things I can bring you that you need? Is there efforts I can contribute that you want, you know? And I think too many of our communist parties, again, because of this infection of Patsockism, whatever you want to call it, in our communist parties here in the West, they don't do this. And they sort of like, they dictate, like, this is what revolution is. We want the House of Nations, but then they will go ahead and send like thousands or millions of dollars to Cuba, which is, okay, that's great because we are like participating in the blockade of Cuba, but then send nothing to indigenous communities in their own country that are fighting against colonialism and actually trying to wage a revolution. It's like these communist parties could actually support a revolution materially if they gave those things to First Nations. But again, they're infected with that idea that, oh, well, that First Nation struggle might not call itself communist. So, you know, we wouldn't want to give money to that. Cuba calls itself communist. So that's better for optics of our white communist membership, basically. So I think that's, and if you are in a communist party, I'm not going to deny that in your local cells and in your local organizations, good work can be done. I'm not denying that. Good work can be done. Your party can do great work in local areas. And I think if you think the best course of action is for you to try and work within those parties and change the leadership and get them on the correct path or get them on the correct program, fantastic, right? But you have to recognize that settler colonial party, as much as it calls itself that, is not the vanguard of revolution, because the inherent vanguard of revolution here is First Nations people. And so far, none of these parties are led by First Nations or Black people or anyone other than white people. And that's just the fact of the matter, that their leader, that's what their leadership is. And many of them will like in such a cringe, like chauvinistic way, many of them will even put forward people of color candidates to be the public face of the party or to be like their runner in this area, while the leadership is sort of like hidden or like obscured, you know? Whereas like if you look at communist parties who have actually gained like a foothold in revolution, they're very open about who their leaders are. You know what I mean? And even like indigenous movements are very open about who their leaders are. So yeah, read your local histories. Read people like Gerald Horne. Definitely, you should, like Gerald Horne's The Apocalypse of Colonialism, The Dawning of the Apocalypse is a great one. The Apocalypse of Settler Colonialism is another great one. The Counter-Revolution of 1776 is great. You know, Palo Alto is a great work for people to read, and as well as things like Juche. But I think Juche, what Juche functionally does is it's its own unique philosophy. But at the same time, because it critiques the leftovers of bourgeois philosophy and Marxism, Leninism, at the same time teaches people how to be and how to think better as a communist. And that's why I sort of look at Juche, and when I try and explain to people as Juche as a litmus test, and when they start like making assumptions of straw mans about it, I can see that they're really trying to, again, overcomplicate things in order to justify this incorrect position. And that's why I think if you really read Juche and listen to what it's saying, it spells right out. You have to study your own revolution. You have to not take the Marxist-Leninist classics as the criteria for your revolution. That was a big problem in Korea. Where in Korea they were literally doing things like they would hang pictures of Stalin or Lenin, or if the Communist Party of Russia had a picture of a mountain in Russia, at their party conference, the Korean communists would do the same thing with the exact same mountain, a Russian mountain. Wow. And Kim Il-sung would say, this is really flunkious. Our people are not going to look at that Russian mountain and be inspired by it. They want to look at Korean things. They want to learn about Korean things. And what these white communist parties are doing is they come in with their programs and stuff, and what they're trying to do is introduce whiteness into our struggle for liberation, right? Because they're saying this is our theory, this is it, and this is communism, and if you don't get behind it, you're not worth supporting, essentially. Is functionally what they're saying to us right now. So yeah. Reading recommendations: Decolonial Thinkers, Gerald Horne. I named a bunch. Juche as well. And don't just look for the Marxist Leninists. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I will point out that because in the West, Marxism, Leninism, again, is not just distorted by the bourgeoisie, but it's also distorted by communists with incorrect lines and with chauvinistic attitudes and things like this, and also with Eurocentrism that's left over in Marxism itself. And when First Nations people recognize this and call this out, they call us anti-communist or something. And we're not anti-communist, we're anti-whiteness. We're calling out the whiteness that exists in what you're calling revolution, right? Mm. And so you have to recognize that for what it is, but also recognize that as a result of that, many people, indigenous people, will not call themselves Marxist-Leninist. And that's completely fine, Get
a question here from Decolonized Buffalo. Can Larry speak about how settlers expect indigenous to become proletarianized to be considered revolutionary? Explain what that question is asking. I'm not even sure what that means. In order to be taken seriously, they have to be wage workers?
Yeah, well, it goes back to those original definitions, again, of Marxism, Leninism, and the proletariat and stuff like that. We can consider, this is why in Korea, for example, the intelligentsia, the artists, and the intellectuals were not inherently considered part of the proletariat.
Okay.
And it's the same thing in Stalin's time, in USSR, and in other countries as well. Because in many artist cases, and a lot of artist cases, their surplus value isn't being taken by a capitalist. So they could be considered something like a small capitalist or something akin to a peasant, right? And therefore, by Marxist definition, they're not the most revolutionary. They're not going to be leading the revolution, okay? And now we can also look at another example, homeless people or people who are chronically unemployed and stuff like this. This is what Marx called the lumpenproletariat. And in his analysis of Europe at that time, he said that the lumpenproletariat is in danger of being bribed by the bourgeoisie. But that analysis of social classes was in Europe in 18 whatever. And here we have to reckon with the fact that we have a much different, much much more complex relationship between all these things. And that's why I tried to point out earlier, what matters to determine the motive force of revolution is what their ideology is, what guides them. And you can see this by what their stances are and what their practice is, right? And that's why I keep trying to highlight, like, these indigenous movements that don't call themselves even communist are what is to be supported if you support revolution, you know? And that's because of the experience of colonization, because of our collective, we already, you know, have collectivism. We fight against individualism as in general, basically. We're coming from a different understanding. And so our lumpen proletariat, native lumpen proletariat, and and black lumpen proletariat, as the Black Panther Party pointed out before, are not susceptible to being bribed by the bourgeoisie in the same way white workers are. And in fact, many of them have a much more revolutionary outlook than white workers do, than the white proletariat does. And that's why what matters is their ideology. And that's why I say, like, even if First Nations people don't have majority proletarian populations, they are still the most revolutionary section, right? Regardless of whether they're lumpen or whatever they are. And I mean, you know, you can take this the other way too, where we know that even people from an undesirable class can be made to be revolutionary if they're given the proper education and the proper leadership. Again, and this is the position that settlers, regardless of their class, occupy, that they need to, like, I'm sorry, but they need to be educated and they need to be guided by colonized people, by revolutionaries. Like, not just colonized people in general, but by revolutionaries. They need to be guided by revolutionaries because they themselves have a vested interest as a political entity. I'm not talking, like, don't take this individually. And when I say us, I'm not talking about me individually. I'm talking about us First Nations people and other colonized people. And when I say you, I mean white people as a political entity, not you, Jim, or you, Bob, you know? And so you have to realize that as an entity, they're not revolutionary. They need to be taught. They need to be behind the leadership.
Okay, Joe 110's got a long question here. My question: what do you think about the means Indigenous people use and potentially might use moving forward? Nonviolent action to bring Canada to higher international courts for violating several treaties, arming Indigenous communities that already have some degree of autonomy. I guess the question is, what is to be done?
I mean, it's a multitude of things, just like with any revolution, just like with the Russian Revolution. You know, people accepted the fact that Lenin, in his time and in Russia at that time, it was viable for them to work within also the parliamentary system of the bourgeoisie in order to try and draw people closer to revolution and closer to communism, right? And the Bolsheviks participated not just in direct actions, but also in parliamentarism as well. And they engaged with however they could in order to anything that progresses the revolution is a good thing, right? Regardless of how it's won. And in the case of Landback, if First Nations people are realizing sections, and Landback is more than just the land coming back. As I said, it's liberation, right? But if First Nations people are realizing the return of land, that's still a benefit that goes towards decolonization. That's a benefit towards liberation. So in the context of those legal struggles, that's a good thing. That's something that weakens the colonial system and strengthens the fight for decolonization. So that's a good thing, as is the direct taking of land, expropriation of land without compensation. That's a good thing too. Like, all of these things are a benefit that enhances that. And First Nations people are going to work on all of those fronts. We're going to work on the legal front. We're going to work within whatever systems we have to. We're going to use the treaties to show what hypocrites settler colonialism is and settlers are. And we're going to use all of these things in order to keep pushing back and keep gaining, keep consolidating and materializing our revolution, our liberation, right? We will keep working on all of those fronts until liberation is fully realized. So the question of what is to be done comes down to, where are you talking about? You know, like like here in Mi'kmaq Kai, it could be different. It all depends on the struggle and what's going on, right? Like, and what the relations are. Like, if you read Glenn Sean Coulthard, you'll learn a lot about the Dene Nation, and you'll learn about the Dene direct struggles for land back and liberation, their violent forms of resistance, and you'll also learn about the legal forms of resistance and the contest against more like overt or more covert rather forms of genocide, like reconciliation politics and things like this. So it really depends, right? And that's why I said, like at the beginning of the talk, what people need to realize is what informs the path that revolution is going to take is yes, in the hands of the leaders and the revolutionaries, but it's also in the hands of the people who fight against the revolution. And we have to adapt to whatever measures they are going to take against us. And we have to be ready to use whatever means will give us success, right? And a lot of times those means are decided by what the oppressors are going to react with. Like, much of like what Russia had to do was because of the contest against the bourgeoisie. What DPRK does today with nuclear weapons, it's doing that because it's forced into that position by imperialism and by colonialism, right? Like DPRK would be happy to not have ever developed nuclear warheads. But the fact was, in order to consolidate and defend their gains of revolution, they had to do that. And you know, we can extend that same knowledge to First Nations. They will do what must be done. And at the end of the day, it's up to the First Nations to decide what is to be done, and not isolated or individually, but again, together.
So following up, how to support, we have a question here in chat. Is there a website we can find maybe in Canada or the U.S. For local First Nations to support? How could someone find out what their local First Nations are?
I mean, you're gonna have to do some homework, right? Like I gave you a map at the beginning of this, native land, and that's really a good resource for looking to see what nations are on the land that you are in, and then you're gonna have to do some homework. You know, we're not gonna come to you. And we're tired of chasing fucking white people, to be honest. Like, colonized people are so tired of chasing white people, yet we still do it, right? Like, we still chase after them, but we're tired of it. And if you want to be a revolutionary, you're going to have to do some of the legwork yourself, which means you're going to have to do investigation. You're going to have to figure out what nation's land you're in. And as comfortable as it may be, I know a lot of people are not used to going outside and touching grass and stuff like that in this day and age, but sometimes you're going to have to do that, especially, or at least pick up the phone, right? Like, you're not going to necessarily be able to email. You might have to pick up the phone. You might have to go there and talk and figure this out, you know? And like I say, ask them, is there something I, as a settler, can do to help whatever struggle this is? And like I say, they will tell you, yes, sure, or no, fuck off. And if they tell you to fuck off, don't take it personally. You know, don't. And like I say, if they tell you you're not allowed in this space, or you're not allowed in that space, or sorry, you're not part of this conversation, please stand over there. Again, don't let your white fragility get in the way and like take this as like an attack against you and like, but I'm one of the good ones, you know? Just understand that you have no right to dictate what First Nations people are doing to fight against a system that, whether you like it or not, you are here to perpetrate, right? You are a pawn of to perpetuate. And that's why if you call yourself a progressive and a revolutionary, you really have a duty to unpack that and fight against that. Because, I mean, just think about Israel and Palestine today. You know, now we have a perfect example. Like, is there any Israeli who is not guilty of perpetuating that genocide if they're not either going home or actively fighting against that? Right? No. well, this just because here the genocide has changed forms and has taken on reconciliation and like destroying our culture through these legalized institutions doesn't make it any less. It's still a genocide. You know, it's still eliminating our people, and therefore you still have a responsibility. If you want to be progressives, if you want to be revolutionaries, if you don't want to be colonizers, you're gonna have to. You got to contribute in some way to that struggle. Otherwise, in function, you are still you're reactionary in function, right? Otherwise.
Okay, Larry. Before we wrap it up here, we discussed Landback. This was sort of an introduction, and I really appreciate how you went into depth with a lot of different things. But this was definitely considered an introduction to Landback, and it was definitely geared towards Marxists. People who identify with Marxism in some way. And we discussed that it's a decolonial national liberation movement and theory. So last question, Larry, I don't know if we want to make this a regular thing. I like the idea of this being a jumping board for the next thing that we're going to talk about. There's so much decolonial theory, indigenous history that I need to read, resistance to colonization history that I need to read and educate myself on. And, you know, I think just like you, when you learn something, when I learn something, I feel worthless if I don't share it with other people. So that's obviously one of the goals here. We're trying to catch up on decolonial theory, which is developing as we speak by some people who are in the chat and by some people who I'm literally talking to right now. And that's a truly wonderful thing. So me and myself and my community, we have a lot of catching up to do. So I was thinking, you know, we told folks to read chapter 6 of Foundations on Leninism by Stalin, chapter 6 on the national question. I thought that was a great jumping off point for this conversation. Where do you think you would like for this to go? Do we want to decide now? Do we want to talk about some ideas?
Maybe like, can we think about like maybe 2 or something? These are shorter ones, and because we're talking, because here we're aiming this at Marxist Leninists. I think maybe
it's just Western, Western
communist, whatever. Yeah. But I think like maybe perhaps a good thing for us to read would be some like let's start with a little bit of like maybe some Juche philosophy, and then the next time we have a talk, I can start giving you some indigenous Marxists. And I think like what reading Kim Jong-il will do first is sort of prepare people to have a better understanding of how to think about Marxism, Leninism, right? How better to like think of that in the context of thinking about revolutions here and stuff like that.
Okay. So you're thinking next time Juche?
Yeah. So there's a couple books that I'm gonna link here.
Okay.
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 So this first one I'm going to link here is called On Correctly Analyzing and Reviewing the History of Preceding Revolutionary Ideology of the Working Class.
Okay.
And this is a talk from 1966, and this is a very short work. It's only 13 pages long. That's why I'm saying I'm going to give a couple pieces of homework.
Yeah.
This is essentially like a section in Foundations of Leninism or something.
Okay, yeah.
But he really puts in plain language like what the limitations of Marxism are, why there is limitations, what the limitations of Leninism is, why there's those limitations. And then after that, it would be really fantastic if you can then read the historical lesson in building socialism and the general line of our party, which is really a continuation of that first thing.
Okay.
This is from 1992. So the first one is 66. And Kim Jong-il says, I will one day do a more in-depth discussion about this. Being the busy revolutionary that he was, it took him until 1996 to get the next one out. But I mean, there were still ones in between that. But this is really like that, what he alludes to at the end of that 66 work. And this just, again, goes further into what the historical lesson of trying to build socialism previously was and how that informed the line of DPRK.
Cool.
And I think that will give people a good understanding of like what some of the limitations of Marxism-Leninism are, and then that will sort of, I think, make people more ready to read some stuff that might not necessarily be from self-declared Marxist-Leninists. And we can start getting into some like Glenn-Sean Coulthard and some Frantz Fanon and stuff like this.
How about extra credit if someone wants to go above and beyond?
Well, if you read any of these authors that Rick has listed here, Tayake Alfred or Glenn-Sean Coulthard, Red Skin, White Mask, those are good bonus points as well.
Good bonus points.
If you want to stay in theme with what I'm saying, check out The Fundamentals of Revolutionary Party Building, which is, again, by Kim Jong-il, and that analyzes the reasons for overthrow of the USSR. Let me see.
Oh, as in post-1991, why I was overthrown?
What's that?
You said reasons for overthrow of the USSR. That's as in it was written after 1991, why it was dismantled?
Yeah. Yeah. And it really like goes into like the internal problems of the USSR. It's from 1992. Yeah.
Nice. Awesome.
So it's right after. And actually, the interesting thing about that work is it's a treatise written on the anniversary of the Workers' Party of Korea, but it was a speech given to a coalition of socialist parties who had come to Pyongyang after the dissolution of the USSR to basically hear Korea give a talk on now what is to be done. Now that socialism has faced this setback, now what is to be done? And Kim Jong-il, first of all, gives the historical lessons. They give how to build a revolutionary party, where USSR went wrong in that, and then why that pertains to international unity of revolutionary parties. So that's a really good work. And like if you've ever read Perenni's Black Shirts and Reds, what I find really revealing about this work is some of the things that Perenni points out about that was wrong with the USSR, Kim Jong-il points out as well. However, the difference is that Parenti oftentimes gives a different prescriptive solution. And Kim Jong-il, coming from a socialist society, gives us really one that's like, I think will set light bulbs off in people's heads. Where, for example, with the stagnation and people lying about production and stuff like that in USSR, Perenni said, well, you need some form of small business. You need the restaurants to be privately owned still or something, which like, oh, that's a Perenni L right there, like, and he's got a few, to be honest, Perenni has some rhetoric sometimes that makes him functionally a pat sock in some regards. Okay. And one of them is that outlook. Whereas Kim Jong-il says, no, it's not that you need things to be privately owned. It's that the USSR focused too much on the material incentive and trying to move people by means of money. Whereas if they had engaged in a more strict ideological campaign and made people understand that you working at this restaurant, you making good food, that's contributing to the revolution. If they made them feel that, like in their hearts, then people would have been more willing to just do the best job they could, even though they would make the same whether they do a good job or a bad job, right? Where that's what Perenni said, because they wouldn't make more, because the restaurant wouldn't make as much, they didn't care because they made the same amount. They didn't care whether they did good or bad. Well, that's because they still had a capitalist ideological mindset of money is king. I want to get what's mine. I want to be paid more. In DPRK today, you see like people volunteering for huge construction projects of building like 10,000 and 50,000 flats and stuff like that, because they are taught that if they contribute to this construction, if they go and volunteer at these places, they're contributing to the revolution. They're contributing to building a happy, better life for the future. And guess what? People want to do that, which is the whole idea of us being able to build a moneyless society in the first place. But as I said, it's not a matter of just building socialist society and getting there. We have to train people. We have to re-educate them. And that means we have to come up with new forms other than GDP and material incentive. So I think that's why this work is really going to like hit home for some Marxists, I hope.
You can't help but think how a lot of people think about North Korea, like, why would someone do that? They must be brainwashed. And in a way, like, yeah, their brains have been washed of these like reactionary tendencies. Good for them.
Yeah, exactly. Which, I mean, because the notion of brainwashing, we know, is so silly. Like here in the West, they try to brainwash us, right?
We are the most propagandized people in the history of the world. Are you kidding me? Like, we're the brainwashed ones.
But the proof of the ineffectiveness of brainwashing is shown in Western society, where you have all of these competing ideologies, all of these competing ideas and things, and like personalities and celebrities. Like, you know, this is your political leader. No, if you don't like him, though, this is your political leader. Or it's like, if you don't like him, here's a third option for a political leader, right? Or no, maybe you like this celebrity who's preaching the same thing that these two political leaders are teaching, right? And the reason for that is because the masses will never accept bourgeois ideology readily as their own. They have to be tricked into this. Yeah. So there has to be all of these different things that if the religion thing doesn't trick them, then this aspect of it will trick them, or this aspect of it will trick them, or straight up white supremacy will trick them, right? Whichever one it is. So that shows that they can never be brainwashed under one thing. So the unity that you see in the DPRK behind Kim Jong-un, the representative of the Workers' Party, the representative of the General Staff of Revolution, the unity you see behind him is impossible under force. And it's the same with Stalin, right? That's what we learned with Stalin too. It's impossible by force. And even Stalin and Kim Jong-un have said, well, this makes me feel weird. Please don't do that. And people still do it because that's the natural tendency of revolution. And DPRK basically came to realize this is what the masses build, and we should not discredit the masses for that, right? And so you have a difference there. The reason everybody is able to unite behind Kim Jong-un is because his idea, and the idea of the Workers' Party of Korea, is to make a better society for the people of Korea, you know? And so it's very easy to like unite people behind something that is beneficial to them. And then over 75, 80 years of doing that, you have huge amounts of your population that support that, and militantly so. And that's what you see with DPRK today.
Well, I'm happy we ended with DPRK and it seems like that scares people off. But of course, you know that I'm a pro-Juche guy. So I'm looking forward to talking with you next week, Larry, about Juche, the Juche idea, about the Democratic People's Republic of North Korea, the good Korea, as I like to say. And I want to thank you so much for talking with me today, Comrade Larry, on Leapin' Larry on Leap Day, talking with me about decolonization and liberation. Larry, thank you so much. Really appreciate you. You've been wonderful, and we'll pick a day for next week, and we'll do it again, huh? Oh, we're gonna
for sure.
There we go.
Yeah,
sorry, I was saluting. I forgot to salute the flag.
Come back and talk with you all, and do your homework, comrades. I'll be testing you when I come back.
All right, Leapin' Larry. See you next time, comrade. All right.
The great Dan, he gets everything. He sees what's going on. Thank you, Dan. One of the greats of all time, most powerful men in politics. He controls the internet. The great Dan. Get over here for the cameras, Dan. Get over here.